Right, we start with the trade relations between China and the U.S. The U.S. said it soon will have frank conversations with China. During a speech at Washington-based think tank, U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai said the point of the negotiations is not to inflame trade tensions with China. Now, Nathan King has more from Washington.
After a months-long review of U.S.-China trade policy, the Biden administration's new trade policy towards Beijing seems a lot like the last policy. Tariffs of up to 25% on $360 billion worth of Chinese imports will stay, at least for now, but U.S. businesses that depend on Chinese parts will be able to apply for wider exemptions.
We will start a targeted tariff exclusion process. We will ensure that the existing enforcement structure optimally serves our economic interests. We will keep open the potential for additional exclusion processes as warranted.
What is new is that talks will resume, though no date was given, and that the Biden administration says it will push China to deliver on its purchases and other commitments under the Phase 1 trade deal.
But our analysis indicates that while commitments in certain areas have been met, that certain business interests have seen benefits, there have also been shortfalls in others. But the reality is, this agreement did not meaningfully address the fundamental concerns that we have with China's trade practices.
Tai also said that the U.S. will challenge China on its state support for industries, specifically for semiconductors and artificial intelligence and other industries of the future. This comes as Washington is poised to step up state support for the very same industries. Unlike the Trump administration, Tai said her team will focus on bringing more allies into the process, even though partners in the European Union, like France and Germany, have very different trade policies towards Beijing and are not part of the Phase 1 trade deal. Also, the US Trade Representative did not mention COVID and the obvious disruption it had on the trade agreement. For its part, China has always maintained that for trade relations to improve, then tariffs should be lifted first, especially now as the global economy is struggling to recover from the pandemic and price rises create inflationary pressures, and also there are pressures on global supply chains. The silver lining of these announcements from the US Trade Representative, however, is that it looks like discussions, if not negotiations, will resume with their Chinese counterparts soon. That could help improve the climate of relations between the two countries. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
Right, now let's take a look at this Phase 1 trade agreement and overall bilateral trade talks.
The trade war eased when China and the U.S. signed the Phase 1 trade agreement in January last year. The deal covered intellectual property, technology transfers, food, and financial services. It also included exchange rates and trade expansion while creating the Evaluation and Dispute Resolution Office. Under the agreement, the U.S. cut some tariffs, and China agreed to buy more American goods and services worth at least $200 billion over 2 years, including $32 billion in farm products. Based on import value, China was the largest trading partner of the U.S. in 2020. China especially increased imports of American farm goods. Pork and cotton imports reached record highs last year, even when the U.S. economy contracted by nearly 5%. And despite American global exports being down by 13%, its exports to China grew by 17%. A U.S.-China Business Council report says more than 60,000 jobs in Mississippi were supported by exports to China in 2019.
And a group of U.S. business associations are urging the Biden administration to address the Trump-era tariffs on Chinese products. And over 30 organizations say the tariffs are costly and burdensome. In a letter addressed to U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Trade Representative Katherine Tai, and the group say the Chinese government has met important commitments made in the Phase 1 agreement that benefit American businesses, and they want Washington to continue talks with China on removing both nations' counterproductive tariffs as soon as possible. And the group notes that Yellen has also said the tariffs have harmed American consumers, and they cite a recent analysis from Moody's which indicates that the American importers are hit much harder by the tariffs than the Chinese exporters. The U.S. importers are paying around 18.5% more for affected Chinese products, while the Chinese side receives just 1.5% less. And earlier we spoke to Anna Ashton from the US-China Business Council, one of the signatories to the letter, and she shared some insights on expectations from the US business community and also the term recoupling between Chinese and US economies.
We've been waiting for 9 months now for the Biden administration to complete this China policy review and trade policy review. And this rollout, I think we're going to hear more from other members of the administration. This is just one little slice of the rollout of this policy review, but it seems a lot like what we've had to date, which is a Biden administration that is has every intention of sticking largely to the tools and the remedies that the Trump administration left in place. We didn't hear a lot about a new approach at all. We heard that we're going to continue to use tariffs as a major tool in addressing our trade issues with China. We heard a defense that wasn't a detailed defense of tariffs as an effective tool, but I didn't hear anything about how they've been effective and no addressing the ways that they have been bad for U.S. economic interests. We heard that phase one is going to be a focus in enforcing the terms of the phase one deal. And we heard that there will be dialogue to talk about other aspects of the trade relationship, but no when, no who, no where. So it was a bit disappointing. Recoupling was such an interesting term. It's unclear what that means. To what extent has the Biden administration assessed that we have decoupled? There are certainly areas where tension is very high and trade is sliding, but I wouldn't say that we've decoupled yet. We've been worrying about the extent to which we might decouple. Recoupling sounds positive in the sense that it's a recognition that there are pragmatic realities here for both of our economies that mean that we need to be able to continue doing business with each other.
And now for more insight into Catherine Tai's speech, we are joined online by Mr. Liu Baochung over Skype from Beijing. He's the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. And also Mr. Joseph Gregory Mahoney is joining us from Memphis. He's a professor of politics at East China Normal University. Gentlemen, welcome to Global Watch. Well, first of all, Professor Liu, about the message sent by Catherine Tai in her speech, we have some positive message from her speech, such as recoupling instead of decoupling. But we also saw some negative messages as well, such as some fundamental concerns on trade practices have not been addressed by the phase one deal, etc. So how do you make of the general tone of her speech?
Well, I do not really see much of the invention which was expected from her speech over the Trump administration. The basic logic is okay, the collaboration between China and the US is very important, but there are lots of problems, and most of the problems are created by China unilaterally. And therefore, there needs to be a level playing field for businesses. But the core is still the American interest first. You know, from her speech, you read the tonality, you read the words, that it is American industry, it is American workers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's there to push China with what is expected to be the dominance of the U.S. economy and the other U.S. might to corner China into serving the U.S. interests. So there's, you know, when they are talking about level playing field and fair practices and what is really fairness in this regard, simply demanding on China's obligation. And also that what is really the biggest missing piece is that what has China contributed to the U.S. economy, to the U.S. consumer livelihood, and nothing was mentioned over there. So we do not really see much of the change, although engagement is there. Engagement has always been there. As our previous speaker said, we didn't decouple, and there's no way to recouple, based on the non-decoupling.
Right. So in general, you think it's not an out of expectations in a positive way of speech?
Not at all, because she was elaborating on the targeted exclusion. Exclusion was also there under review by the business application. It is just there that they just wanted to ensure to the U.S. businesses that they are doing the right job, but nothing was really creative.
Right, and Joseph, what China is concerned the most is the tariff, and Catherine Tai did mention that in her speech. She said the U.S. would begin excluding some tariffs on China, but she was light on details. What are your expectations?
Well, I agree that a lot of her speech was negative and certainly didn't note the positives that China's contributed. And I don't think that's unexpected given the state of the rhetoric that's been coming out of Washington. And I don't think we should be overly optimistic. At the same time, I think there is a little bit of political theater involved here where she's deliberately trying to talk tough. But once we return to negotiations, I think we will see some movement in large measure because the trade war has really hurt the United States more than it has hurt China, particularly during the COVID period. And Biden is needing to find a way forward, not because he has any affection for China, but because the costs of the U.S. are so high. So I think what we're going to see is she'll talk tough, and he'll try to avoid, Biden will try to avoid looking like he's going soft on trade, but once we get down to the actual negotiation, we'll start seeing some things come off the table. But the odd, looking past this rhetoric, the oddest thing she did today was discredit the Trump tariff approach, but then returned to the Trump negotiated phase one as the baseline for moving forward, with the rather tepid excuse that this is the deal in place. Now, we'll likely see, again, as she said, these requests that China complete purchase agreements, despite the significant increases we saw since the phase one was negotiated, and then following that with a quid pro quo process where each side puts things on the table and follows through, hopefully, with de-escalation, so neither side can be seen as a loser. But clearly, sensitive technology and other matters related potentially to security will remain off limits. Right,
and Professor Liu, as Joseph just said, that Catherine Tai might be just talking tough, but she says that while China was meeting some commitments under the phase one deal, there have been shortfalls. What's your take? Do you think she's making some senses, or she's just talking tough?
Well, she's been talking tough, and the sense is that, okay, by those shortfalls, she meant not really on specific figures for this implementation, because I do not really think that the USTR has done a thorough review over the specific figures for the implementation with phase one yet. However, she is really pointing out to the unfair practices, quote unquote, on the China side. And she is also referring to the Chinese dominance of the industry, be it steel, be it solar panels, and also the Made in China 2025, et cetera, et cetera. By saying all that, on the other hand, she is trying to elaborate on how U.S. can really strengthen itself and continue its dominance by government subsidies, to the innovation industry, to subsidize the farmers and also the industrial workers, etc. And then she comes back and complains, China's subsidy issues, etc., etc. It seems that it's really a one-sided type of approach. So although the engagement is proposed and how it's going to be done in what she mentioned about new holistic and pragmatic approach, and we are waiting to see. The interdependence between the two biggest economies, despite all the political rhetorics, they are there. And China should really remain firm and tough towards what is really the benefit for China and what is the fair way of dealing across the Pacific.
All right. Well, Joseph, Catherine Tai also said the U.S. will use a full range of tools and develop new ones to defend America's economic interest. Do you think China should be nervous about those comments?
Well, again, she was vague on these points, but she did seem to indicate three that I'll mention. The first is the possibility of new investigations into Chinese state subsidies, particularly in key industries like semiconductors, AI, and green tech, and how these might create unfair competitive practices. And second, investigations into whether Chinese firms are engaging in intellectual property right violations or engaging in industrial espionage and so on. And third, the old standby, whether China engages in predatory practices like dumping, or again by subsidizing state firms in ways that undercut prices and American manufacturing in the global market. And as was noted earlier, the follow-on to this may well be that the U.S. Itself begins to subsidize in its own industries as a competitive response.
So, gentlemen, we are now talking about the trade relations between the two biggest economic powers in the world. Professor Liu, how do you think the trade dispute between these two powers will possibly affect global trade?
Well, first of all, it hurts the U.S. economy and Chinese economy, and that's definite. But also being the two biggest giants in the mountain of the global village, and they are also hurting the global trade by quite a level of percentage, because they are occupy very important position in the global supply chain, and coupled with the pandemic, and this is really a uphill battle for the entire global economy as how they can really recover, and how the U.S. and China play a really positive leadership role in revitalizing the global economy, and that really quite a test the wisdom and political will, of the both countries. But it seems that with still the tariff hanging in the air and trying to leverage to the unilateral interest of the United States, we do not really see a very positive future for these two, how these countries can really continue to contribute, at least as expected by all the global economies.
Joseph, what do you think?
Well, the thing that I found most interesting today in her speech is the increasingly recognized truism that the U.S. go-it-alone approaches, especially those adopted by Trump, and to a large extent his predecessors, are no longer sufficient. At one point in time, the U.S. could bully any country economically and usually win, but that's no longer the case with China. And this doesn't just pertain to economic affairs, but also military affairs, as we've seen with the AUKUS and Quad efforts. And second, this statement that the U.S. is going to try to work with allies and try to find common cause with other countries on economic fronts, countries that might eschew additional military alliances like South Korea, for example, but might be drawn on shared economic concerns. And certainly it responds to countries like Australia, who feel they've been on the receiving end of heavy-handed tactics from Beijing. And it also probably aims to extend an umbrella towards erstwhile allies in Europe who've negotiated new agreements with China, but also waffled on them. So I think all of these are sort of the important subtext of the times, where the U.S., the relative power of the U.S. is clearly in decline, and it's seeking help to sustain its position globally.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Liu Baochung, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics, and also Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your insights.